Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mary Texera. I teach in the Department of Sociology, and more importantly, I am a member of the CORP committee, and that is Conversations on Race and Policing. And with that in mind, we have a wonderful guest today. Her name is Siobhan Brooks. She is a professor of sociology, and I have to throw sociology in, yes. Siobhan, I'm sorry. And African American Studies at Cal State Fullerton. And she has a really interesting topic for us today having to do with policing and the LGBT community, LGBTQ community. But first, as always, we need to acknowledge the land on which we reside. We recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous people. So with that, I will turn the program over to Professor Brooks, and go ahead, Professor Brooks.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Mary, for inviting me to be part of this very important dialogue around policing. And I want to thank the larger Cal State San Bernardino community for inviting me. So what I'm going to share is an overview of my book that recently came out, Everyday Violence Against Black and Latinx LGBT Communities. And one of the main arguments of the book is that, you know, with the event of the Pulse shooting that took place in Orlando, Florida in 2016, there's been a lot of discussion around hate crime laws, a result of that, gun control. And my book basically argues that none of those really get to the heart of why the violence happens in the first place, and that actually hate crime laws do more damage than good. All right, so let me just pull up my screen here. This is the cover of my book. It's going to be coming out in paperback in May, so I will put a plug also to let you know that. So one of the things that really got me interested in the book was the responses from some activists that are very, you know, active in anti-policing organizations, anti-racist struggles, and their silence when this particular shooting happened, right? So I viewed this as silence as discursive violence. And one of my colleagues summed it up, what a lot of us in the LGBT community felt by the silence of our comrades that are usually, you know, on board when it comes to various social justice movements. This is a quote from one of my colleagues at Cal State Fullerton. Right after the shooting at Pulse, my heart was broken knowing that this homo/transphobic act had taken place. I expected others on Facebook, queer and not, to be enraged. I was saddened, disappointed, and angry that people seemed to be indifferent. I noticed many of my heterosexual identified friends and family were not posting anything. And that quote is from Dr. Eddie Francisco Alvarez, who's an assistant professor of Chicano Studies here at Cal State Fullerton. And I really pondered, why was this? You know, you had 50 people murdered. Why was there not the same outrage that we usually see? And one of the things that I talk about is the representation of who's in the queer community, right? And based on that representation, what kind of policies get suggested. So as we can see, these are the photos of the people that were killed in the shooting. And as you can tell from the photos, most of them are queer people of color, specifically queer Latinx people. This happened on, Latino night in a queer club, Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida. And yet, when we looked at media coverage, we had people like Anderson Cooper, we had people like Ellen, DeGeneres, who basically made this into kind of this other issue around like, we need more gun control laws, we need more, hate crime laws. And what was invisible were the actual identities of the people who were killed, and the intersectional reasons of why that happened were also erased, right? So part of what I argue in the book is that hate crime laws they fail to protect LGBT people, but particularly LGBT people of color. And when it comes to the LGBT community, the murder that really put this issue of hate crime laws in a national light was the murder of Matthew Shepard that happened in 1998 in Wyoming. He was a gay, HIV positive white man who was killed and tied to a fence. And this was, horrible. This really put violence that happens against LGBT people in the spotlight. However, the issue is that, you always have to have a perfect victim when it comes to putting any sort of legislation in action. And so he was the perfect victim. He's, white, he's very normative looking, wholesome. And so he became the poster child for violence that happens against gay people. And not to belittle this was horrible, but the issue a lot of people in the LGBT of color community has is that, but this sort of violence happens to queer people of color all the time, particularly transgender women of color. So, during the time that he was murdered, there was actually a murder of a Black transgender woman, and she didn't get any coverage. And so the other issue is that there's an assumption that everybody can use hate crime laws, if they're victims of hate crime. And so it ignores things like immigration status, the financial burden of what happens when somebody is attacked. So one of the things I look at in my book are a lot of the effects that happen. So if people survive hate crimes, they are usually left with a lot of financial burden. They usually have been, harassed by police. Police don't believe them. Police, often blame queer people of color for acts of violence happening towards them. And then there's also the mental health damage that a lot of survivors of hate crimes have. And then for the people that didn't survive a hate crime, what I look at in my book is the effects on their actual families and communities, which usually results in marginalization, lack of resources, stigma, right? And so overall, this focus on hate crimes and like more police really takes away from putting resources where they really need to be, which are in my mind, schools, healthcare systems, strengthening the families, and so on. So that is one of the key issues with, why hate crime legislation fails. Also, one of the things I argue in my book is that it's not a crime to hate people, right? And so what is a hate crime, right? So we know that Trayvon Martin, for instance, many of us, that's the origin of Black Lives Matter. He was, murdered by, George Zimmerman, and it was not seen as a hate crime, but that has been the legacy of people of color, being killed. And it's almost seen as normal, right? It's often not seen as a hate crime, right? And the other issue is that it doesn't take into account that, just like with gender violence, a lot of LGBT violence, unfortunately, happens within communities and families. It's not always like stranger danger. So hate crime laws don't necessarily address that. They just look at individual acts of violence, but they don't look at structural, issues like unemployment, discrimination, and such. And so again, when it comes to people of color and relationships with police violence and documentation, the first example of this that many of us remember were the Rodney King riots of 1991. And many of us, myself included, I was a college student at San Francisco State. I was in the protest. I was one of the students arrested for protesting this. We thought that with the video coverage, for sure these cops would be indicted, and they weren't, right? And so we just see this time and time again, that even when you have documentation, and this is the same with, anti-LGBT violence that goes viral, you have documentation, but the documentation does not lessen the violence, right? And so similarly, hate crime laws do not lessen violence against people. In fact, the opposite sometimes happens, where when people are viewed to be of a special category, whether it's race or sexual orientation, sometimes people think, oh, well, those lives are valued over mine. And so then it can actually cause more animosity towards an already marginal group. So an example of that would be, the Supreme Court refused to hear cases last year of qualified immunity for cops, right? But at the same time, the Supreme Court extended the Civil Rights Act to include LGBT issues in terms of not being discriminated in the workplace, right? Which is good, but I think because law in and of itself doesn't often take intersectionality into account, it does, when you leave off things that are specifically race-based or disproportionately affect people of color, they do a disservice when you're looking at queer people of color who are affected by, anti-employment discrimination and also police violence. So that leads to what happens when queer people of color do experience hate crimes. So this is a photo of Gwen Araujo, who was a trans Latina woman who was killed in early 2000s, like 2002. And this is a quote from her mother when I asked her what was the encounter like when she was trying to report what happened to her daughter. Her daughter had went to a party and she was murdered by a group of boys. And so this is her quote: "When Gwen first went missing and we filed a police report, they put her down as a runaway. They concluded because she was Latina and in their minds lived in a bad neighborhood that she must be a runaway. I found that very offensive, and it illustrated the disregard that they had for her." And this is from Sylvia Guerrero, who was the mother of Gwen Araujo. And so this was very common in my research. I interviewed 26 people. Some of them were actually at the Pulse massacre. They were survivors, or they worked with people in the community. And then others were people that either had family members who experienced hate crimes, or they had experienced hate crimes themselves. And one of the themes that came up consistently was the police not really believing them or criminalizing them. There was a case, for instance, of a gay male who was attacked by a group of men outside. This was in Oakland, California. And when he called the police couldn't distinguish, who the perpetrators were from the victim because they were all Black, right? And so there's a lot of examples of how police presence either instigates more violence, police abuse, right? Or just indifference. So there's been a long history of police violence and queer people of color. Some examples I talk about in the book are the reality that transgender women of color are often assumed to be prostitutes, and therefore when they are walking down the street, they are harassed by police. The other example that I heard consistently from my research, they just don't take queer violence seriously. So even in the Pulse massacre, the police did not respond right away. There was a long lapse of time before they came, even after the first shot was fired. And then the other thing that we have to remember is that just gay pride, queer rights, are rooted in a fight against police brutality. When you think about the Stonewall riots of 1969, started by Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, that's basically what that movement was, but it's been so commodified over the years. Gay pride has been very commercialized, that it gets further and further away from that root of it originally being against police brutality, and also created by queer people of color. So the other case I look at in the book as an example of what happens when queer people of color are attacked, when they are victims of hate crimes, and then how the state responds. The case of Cece McDonald really illustrates this. So we remember Cece McDonald. She's a Black trans woman who survived a vicious attack in 2012 by white supremacists in Minneapolis, same area of George Floyd uprisings, right? And this happened outside of a bar. As a result, in self-defense, she stabbed her attacker and ended up accepting a plea bargain of 41 months for second-degree manslaughter, which should not have been, right? And then on top of that, she was misgendered, which is common when trans women are in the system. And then she was placed in a men's prison. And so, luckily, because of a lot of activism in the community, she was released, but it was after serving 19 months incarcerated. And so she's one of the rare cases that you hear about of a Black trans woman who's attacked and fighting back. But then her case illustrates what happens and how the police re-victimize a lot of people who are survivors of hate crime by criminalizing them. So what I look at in the book as solutions to, like instead of more police, instead of more hate crime laws, which we see just further incarcerates disproportionately people of color in the criminal justice system, I look at, well, what are some alternative models, right? What do we do? And so I turned to the work of Patrisse Cullors, who I actually interviewed for my book, who's co-founder of Black Lives Matter, in terms of, well, what does restorative justice look like, right? What was apparent was that when a hate crime happens, you see all of the inequality that was preceding the actual act of violence sort of lay bare, right? So I spoke to her about, well, what does this look like? And her response was this: we have to connect state violence and intimate violence. The cycle of individual harm and violence mirrors state and government level violence, land occupation, history, and trauma. We live in a culture of intergenerational trauma. And so this quote was very important because it shows us that when you're looking at violence that happens, especially against queer, Black, and Latinx communities, it's a combination of state violence, which of course the police are implicated in that. But unfortunately, it also implicates our own institutions that should be keeping queer people of color safe, but unfortunately also become implicated in the acts of violence, right? Our churches sometimes, our educational systems, our healthcare systems, our family structures even sometimes all play a role in what happens, to have something as drastic as a Pulse massacre occurring. This is Letitia King. She was a young trans teen at E.O. Green Middle School in Oxnard, California. And she was shot and killed actually in front of a teacher and students in a computer lab after she asked a white boy out for Valentine's Day. And then he was very embarrassed by this. And then the next day he shot her. And one of the things that was focused on was the reaction of certain community members, right? There was a lot of victim blaming The police and also some of the community members felt that because Letitia was trans, she somehow brought this on herself. She should have known better than to ask Brandon to the Valentine's dance. And so this quote is from a book about the case. It says, the problem with Larry, which was her dead name, they explained was not that he was gay. When administrators approached Marina and told her she was not allowed to hold hands with her girlfriend at school, she stopped holding hands with her girlfriend. Marina got it, said one of the jurors. Larry didn't get it. And so this quote illustrates how a lot of anti-LGBT violence is seen, that somehow people bring this on themselves. Like if they just stay in the closet, if they're trans and they just don't transition, or they should know better than to, ask somebody to a dance. A lot of this illustrates the state violence, but also the cultural violence that happens that ends up marginalizing a lot of queer youth of color. The other institution is obviously our churches, some of our churches, our religious institutions. When some people experienced hate crimes and they had to, and it ended in murdered, and they had to figure out what kind of service are they going to give their loved ones. One of the things that was described with some of my interviews was the challenge of finding a church that would hold a service. So this is a quote from someone I interviewed who was friends with a trans Latina woman who was murdered in Anaheim, and her name was Zoraya Reyes. And this quote reads, "When we were trying to find a Catholic church to hold a service, many refused us. They wouldn't hold service or bury her because she was transgender. So we finally found a Catholic church, and it was $100 more than the other churches." That's Javier, a friend of Zoraya. And so this shows that there's a lot of work to do at the state level, and then there's also a lot of work to do at the local and community level. Healthcare is another institution that, again, instead of putting money into more policing and hate crime laws, we really, one of the things that we need to do, train healthcare providers in terms of how to provide adequate mental health services and just general healthcare services for LGBT people. So this is a person I interviewed who had experienced a hate crime and had financial challenges and struggles trying to get healthcare. And so one of the things that they quote here, this is what led to the violent act. They were at a concert and someone said, "Are you a boy or a girl?" Before I could respond, he punched me in the eye and mouth. My friend broke up the fight, not security. I filed a police report. I was unemployed and uninsured. I got butterfly stickers instead of stitches. Luckily, I put up some photos of my injuries on a GoFundMe page and raised $7,500. And this is P, a gender nonconforming survivor of hate crime. So again, when people experience hate crimes, there's a lot of assumptions of what is available for you if you survive it. Like there's an assumption that, you can go to the police. There's an assumption that you could just get health care. And these things are not necessarily true. Housing is another issue that people in my book talked about in terms of when we look at structural violence, in addition to the police violence, housing continues to be an issue, racism and housing for queer people of color. I interviewed someone who works at an organization, Post One, that was a nonprofit created after the Post Massacre to help people in Orlando overcome the crisis. And so this is Ramona. And when I asked her what were some of the resources available for some of the survivors of the Post Massacre, she said, regarding the survivors, some tried to continue on with work. Some want to continue going to events at a gay bar, I just feel if they were white and straight, more doors would open, like housing. I worked with an organization that has 166 units of affordable housing for the survivors, but the apartments are in drug-fested areas, right? So again, this is the issue with, looking at queerness as only white, only middle class, and it really does a disservice because research shows that most queer people are not that demographic. And in fact, more people of color identify as being LGBT than white, contrary to what we see in the media. And with that, like what we see in the post situation, many are under-resourced, right? But that's not the dominant image that people have of the LGBT community. So instead of investing, right, in just more corporal punishment that has been proven does not help at all, and if anything, just makes things worse, overall, my book makes the argument that we need to invest in more restorative justice models, and really unpacking what does that look like. I think what I learned from my research is that there's not a consensus in the community of what does this look like. Some people felt restorative justice would be education. We need to educate people. We need to educate people on LGBT issues, why it was wrong, need to have sex education, like all these different sort of educational models were some solutions people had. Other people felt that the community really needs to shame people who had, perpetuated violence. And there was a split on that because shame is often also why a lot of queer people are murdered to begin with, right? Transgender women are murdered because, men are ashamed of being in love with them or, something like that. And so the community was split on, the use of shame as an effective, restorative justice model. Other people overall just felt that there needed to be more education in general in schools, more access to resources, more conversations with community members about things like sexuality and gender identity. So that was really wide open, but definitely there was a consensus overall that we need cultural models, we need more resources in communities of color addressing LGBT issues as opposed to police. And so I'll end here for some discussion, and I'm looking forward to your thoughts. These are basically the top themes that I covered in the book, and so I will stop sharing now. I see that we have a good turnout. And so I'm open to some questions, especially if people have any questions about how I did this research or other questions. I'll look in the chat and see if people have questions.
During your research, Dr. Brooks, did you conclude or did you find any programs being set up by the LGBTQ community to help them with these issues?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that the closest thing I saw was actually in Orlando. They've done a lot of work, and it's unfortunate that it took that horrible massacre to kind of get the community together there, but they've done a lot of work on the ground, both queer organizations and other organizations like immigration organizations. Various entities have come together to try and look at what are the various needs of people, particularly queer Latinos, Latinx folk in Orlando. I think more LGBT organizations have to have an intersectional focus. I mean, obviously there are places in New York that try to do this, the Audre Lorde, Health Center there in Manhattan, and also there's an Audre Lorde Center in Brooklyn. There are some models, but I think what I argue in the book is, in spite of that, anything that's labeled LGBT tends to assume a white middle class identity. And then a lot of the solutions or programming or things that come out of that assume that that's who the audience is. And that actually, one of the things I look at in the book, it underscores violence against queer people of color, because if communities of color in general see LGBT issues as something white, they're less inclined to support those issues. And then when you have queer people of color, sometimes in our communities that are like, hey, I am this ethnic group, but I am also this identity, and this is how this identity affects me in these spaces, then that can be looked at as resentful, because if the issues are really about race, then any other identity is seen as taking the spotlight, if you will, or potential resources from race, right? Because they don't see, because of the way it's portrayed in the media, how LGBT issues are also race issues.
Thank you. And on the same avenue, a nice segue is, in the Black community, one of the biggest issues I see is LGBTQ versus the churches.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak a little bit on that?
I can. I think that, and I have a chapter in the book about the complicated relationship of Black folks in general and the church, but specifically Black LGBT people in the church. I mean, on the one hand, we know historically the church has been, instrumental in freedom movements. We see this in civil rights. There's research in slavery of how, religion in general has been, for a lot of Black people, that beacon of hope, right? And there's been a lot of progressive things that have come out of that. But unfortunately, I think, getting back to respectability politics, the church can also dictate who is a member of the community and who is worthy of community support. Because of structural racism, in a lot of inner cities, there aren't a lot of Black institutions, but there's always a church. There's always a church, no matter how under-resourced a Black space is. That will be one of the few things that exist. And so what can be problematic about that is that then that means that, for under-resourced Black and Latino communities, if that's your only resource is the church, then if you're ostracized from that space, then you don't have a lot of other avenues, right? And I think that's what makes queer people of color, their situation unique than their white counterparts. Like, when you don't have access to your family, when you don't have access to religious spaces where a lot of resources are still circulated in Black and Latino communities, then you become more vulnerable for various types of violence to actually happen, because you don't have the proper support. And so I think that our churches need to be, we need to go beyond tolerant. We at this stage of the game, we need to get beyond tolerant, right? I think a lot of our institutions have moved towards kind of like, we'll tolerate people, but as long as it's kind of like still a don't ask, don't tell. Like, we know people are gay, but we just don't really want to know much about you. I think that too much is at stake. And we need to move way beyond that. Like, a lot of people don't even have faith in churches anymore, because the issues are just so more pronounced than, say, they were with that civil rights model that we're used to with the church. Yeah, that would be my opinion on it. I mean, the church is a good starting point for a lot of that cultural revisioning that needs to happen, because it's still an important institution for Black people, definitely. But I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Yeah, I spent a summer at a camp. I was a camp counselor at a summer camp, and it was a Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I'm bringing this up is I'm just surprised about the Latin LGBTQ community, because the majority of the fathers at the camp were gay.
Mhm.
And yet their views about the gay
Mhm.
is hush hush, quiet. Like you said, don't
Mhm.
tell. And I'm just real surprised, especially when you brought up the fact that you couldn't even find a Catholic church that was willing to open their doors when there was so much going on in the Catholic Church that
Mhm.
is open about Catholic pastors and preachers. So
Mhm. There's
it's
still a lot of
amazing.
work to do.
A lot of what to
And
do.
I think to end on that, I mean, I think, and I've written about this elsewhere, I think in a lot of those sort of spaces, people can be queer, but that can't be any political identity, right? You're like, so in a lot of Black progressive spaces, for instance, maybe not so much the church, but like in general, you can be queer, but that can't be any sort of primary political apparatus that you operate from. You know what I mean? It's like you're queer, but you're still going to do the Black agenda is how we understand that agenda.
Yeah, let's leave that over there and let's keep on doing
Right.
it.
So I think that that's sort of what has shifted. You have like, say, Black lesbians who they are, yes, we are, of course, we're going to march for George Floyd, of course, right? And we should and do, but that's the acceptable way of being a queer person. It's not like we can also look at these murders that happen of like Black trans women or or gay people and expect the community to have that passion behind that as well. Because unfortunately, again, as I said in the beginning, when you look at violence that happens with queer people, it's not just the police. And that's what we don't want to talk about. It's not just the police killing us. It's sometimes our community members are doing that.
And that goes to one of the questions, says, where did you look for these instances of hate crimes? I feel as though I never heard of these cases in the media, especially the news. And that's a good question, because I was seeing things I hadn't heard about also. And so speak on that a little bit.
I think that's a great question. And I think that shows you who controls the media, right? Like, so when we look at what makes the media, if it's something that's labeled gay, it's going to be something like Matthew Shepard. As I mentioned in the beginning, everybody heard of that. Or at least, if you're born maybe in a certain, decade, you've heard of it, but that really galvanized the nation in terms of alerting people, oh my God, like this is horrible, it's a hate crime. But as I mentioned, unfortunately, these hate crimes happen against queer people of color all the time, but they don't make the media. They don't make the media. And so even when you're looking at police violence and reporting of it, many people would assume that that must be only something that happens to Black men, because that's all we see in the media. We unfortunately can name several Black males that have died at the hands of the police. And I'm sorry, my office light goes off and on. But, there's Black women who have died also at the hands of the police, and we don't hear about them. And so the reason why we don't hear about them is not because Black men are just the only ones who are victims of police brutality. It's because the media looks for stories that are palatable to certain understandings of race and gender. And, we live in a patriarchal society. So when there's a story about a Black male that got killed by the police, I think that we hear about it more for two reasons. One, it's dealing with men, in social movements. We know this, they get more attention than women. But then I think also the focus solely on Black, supposedly, assumingly straight Black men being killed by the police does another service, which is it reinforces that Black men are violent and that Black men need to be subdued by the state. So when we see these images of Black men being shot, however they're shot, running in a car, whatever it is, in a way, we also have to look at what that serves, right? And even, I'm not saying it doesn't happen. We know it happens. We're enraged about it. But, to that question of what we see in the media, well, it also reinforces that Black men need to be disciplined. by the police, if that makes sense, right? So there's a reason why certain stories sell, so to speak. And I hate to use that language, but that's, I mean, ultimately, when you're looking at news coverage, that's what they're looking at too. What story is going to sell? And if most people think Black men are violent anyway, then it's easier for those stories to sell because it reinforces what many people think about Black men to begin with.
Mhm. And the description is always big Black man, big
Right.
Black man, not just a Black man, but a big Black.
Right,
Even
right,
though
exactly.
He's 5 foot tall, he's a big Black man.
Right,
That's the fear
exactly,
they have.
exactly. And I think just to put a parallel, because one of the things I tried to say in the book, even with the title, Everyday Violence, Pulse was horrifying. But then there are other acts that lead up to that didn't come out of the blue. Like the acts are, you know, their LGBT issues aren't taught in schools. I mean, when Letitia King was shot in a computer class, they didn't even talk about it at the school. They didn't want to talk about it. I couldn't get an interview with anyone that worked at that school. They did not want to discuss that. As a result, they did not have, you know, classes or discussions about trans. It was as if this person never existed, right? And I think that the racial, you know, parallel would be George Floyd, right? I mean, that's what started this whole series with y'all, right? And I think what's disturbing about that is that it took something like George Floyd happening for white people to see that there was racism. Like what it communicates is that that's the only form of racism that exists. And if a Black person isn't experiencing something that extreme, they're not experiencing racism. So, you know, these things get our country to move forward. And it's disturbing that when it gets to that level of crisis is when it registers as a problem. But
Yeah.
the housing, you know what I mean? But the same thing with the queer community. I mentioned the lack of healthcare, the housing, so, you know, the everyday racism that Black and brown people experience is normal. People don't see a connection with those everyday forms of violence and homophobia leading to spectacular forms of police brutality and violence.
And we constantly say that's the worst thing that could have happened, but at the same time, it's the best thing that could have happened. But I actually thought that change would come about with Rodney King, and it didn't.
Right.
And it was shocking, and that of course the result was a Watts riot. But that was something terrible happened, and we all saw it.
Right.
And we saw it. I mean, we had to time that beating of Rodney King, but the whole thing is, it didn't change a thing.
And then from that, we've seen, unfortunately, several other documentation, digitization, you know, like internet now, this is pre-internet now, there's internet footage of violence, and it doesn't, you know, it doesn't solve anything. And in my book, I write about how a lot of that is very trauma inducing, like these images, and that they really hark back to lynchings. You know, same thing, lynching was happening. You had Ida B. Wells, you know, you had different people out there, and, you know, so these images have always been there, but the action is slow in response to those images.
Go ahead, Mary.
Did I have my hand up?
Well, I know you have a question.
You know me too well, Dan. You know me too well. You know, Dr. Brooks, I am very sorry that I had to step away, but I did explain to you all before why I had to. But I'm just wondering if you mentioned the case of, although he was not a person of color, I think this fits very well with that intersection of policing and the LGBT community, and that's Brandon Teena. Brandon Teena was, you know, the movie Girls Don't Cry, Boys Don't Cry,
right,
was based on his story. But I think that what I have done in the past in my classes, there's a short video clip of his interrogation after he was raped. And it's just one of the worst police interrogations I've ever seen. It was just homophobic. It was sexist. And And as a result of them not filing charges, these two people came back and murdered her and her friends brutally. You know, not that there's an unbrutal murder, but I think that that I am sure people of color have undergone interrogation just like this, or the fact that they allow or they will put male identified transgender men as they'll put them in male prisons or excuse me, in female prisons, or vice versa. The most harmful are the female identified going into male prisons. So I think that these are incidents that the more we talk about them, because I see there was a question in there about where do we go in terms of the subaltern, in terms of the people who don't have voices. And what do you think? What do you think we should do?
No, thank you for all that. What I did discuss, and you might have stepped away, Mary, the case of CC McDonald, a lot of those issues sort of, brewed in her case. But I think in terms of where, I think dialogues like these are a start. I think talking about LGBT issues in race specific spaces are critical. I think having these dialogues are good. I think having resources really, for people who are religious, really having progressive, real discussions about LGBT people in needs in churches, families. Like, I really think it starts there. I think it starts there because that's part of the restorative justice model that we need to invest in, so that we're not looking for police to reform. We're not looking for a police department to have a rainbow flag in it, or, some Black commissioner, that we're getting away from this notion that we have also seen, right? Of like, well, if we just have more diverse people in the police departments, then, really getting away from that, because no matter who's there, that's a system that is corrupt, right? That's a system that, it doesn't matter who's in there. The outcome is not going to be good in the long run. So instead, how do we invest in our communities in ways that are meeting the needs and making it safe for all of us? How do we have these conversations in our classes? It's the curriculum. When we don't have critical race theory, that sends a message. When we don't have LGBT studies, that sends a message of people being marginal, right? I think it really starts at the ground level.
Yes. And I'm so proud of the students in Florida who are pushing back over it's hard to imagine that in 2021, we actually have the head of a state saying you will be arrested if you use the term gay in your classroom.
There you go. Yep.
Don't say gay. Don't say gay. because you used the term progress a few minutes ago, and yet it seems like we're going back to the 1940s, 50s, in terms of our attitude toward that community. It's just outrageous. It's outrageous.
Yeah, and I think that who's most harmed are young people. We forget young people are the ones that have the least rights. Young queer people of color, particularly, people are coming out earlier and earlier. Healthcare systems need to respond to that. There are people 12 years old, who are already starting hormones. They are trans. So really, we need to be looking at how to support our young queer people of color.
And that governor has actually referred those cases to Child Protective Services in Florida. He says that if parents have their children go through this hormone treatment, that's abuse, and so he wants to stop that.
Right. So that
there's no logic involved in
Dr. Brooks, we want to get you out on time, and I know.
Yes. Yes. So sorry.
So I will say this: one of the as a community person, one of the biggest problems I see is all that education that you just talked about is held in colleges, And so,
Exactly. Mhm.
so think of how many people didn't go to college and don't have that information and may
Right.
never get
Mhm.
that information.
Exactly.
It's a sad state of affairs. We want to thank you for coming and try to get you to your class on time.
Thank you for
Thank-
having me.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks. Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
I'll watch the film because I had to miss quite a bit.
Well,
But thanks again.
thank
Have a good
you.
day.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.